You love her voice, you love her looks, but Melissa loves our comic books. Hi, hi, ho, ho, ho. Welcome to a Christmas time episode. Welcome back. It's been over a month now, and glad to be here. As you can see, I'm still working on the den. It doesn't have all the artwork up in places where I want it yet. Still have most of the things on shelves where I want them, but not everything. And we're not going to focus on that today. We're here to talk about the magic of Christmas. No, we're not. We're here to talk about magic, but it's the magic that was on newsstands in April of 1938 when this little gem came out. Now, this is the first of at least two episodes that we're going to do talking about this. In this episode, we're going to talk exclusively about the Superman story that debuted in this issue because it's really important. I think this is really important to do because there's so much that we know about Superman and the superhero genre that all come later. And it's important to examine this debut appearance of both and try to imagine that we're seeing them with fresh eyes, uninformed by what we know or we think we know from what comes later. We'll include the cover in this episode. It does say January 1938 at the top, but it was not uncommon for comic books to be cover dated 1 or 2 months later than they were released, with the cover date being more of a sell-by reminder for the retailers. At this time, there was no consistency with whether books were 1 month or 2 months ahead, though a common reason to give the retailers more time, the 2 months, would be if they were expecting this book to need more time to sell. The cover is a striking, iconic image that both is and isn't the same as found on page 9 of the interior story. The cover was redrawn by an unknown hand, possibly Joe Shuster himself being given the chance to redo his original drawing more slowly and carefully. The cover is certainly in his style, but with some clear improvements like seeing the actual impact of the car against the rock and the improved rendering of the foreground figure running away. Something I had never considered before was the significance of Superman smashing an automobile and why that was an important thing to signify Superman as a champion of the working class. I was educated on this by an excellent YouTube video by NerdSync, a video made 6 years ago, but I only just recently saw myself. See in the comments section for a link. I mentioned at length last episode about new editor Vince Sullivan's apparent apprehension about the launch of Action Comics. On the inside front cover is more evidence of Sullivan hedging his bets by bribing his new readers. Note how the lack of color in the Chuck Dawson feature is turned from a negative into a positive by making it into a coloring contest. Just color a page and tear it out from what will become the best-selling comic book of all time, one copy selling for a record $6 million just last year. I assume it still had all of its Chuck Dawson pages intact. 12 of the 13 pages of Superman gracing this issue were adapted from comic strip format to fit the comic book page, but not the first one. This one-page origin story was almost surely written on request to become the first page of the comic book since it isn't formatted like the other pages. It is possible that Siegel and Schuster volunteered to create this page, but they were also awfully busy producing new material for 5 other features a month and probably appreciated the opportunity to recycle old material in this issue. And this becomes a crucial distinction of the superhero genre, not the recycling, the actual origin story, that superheroes have to be explained by an origin story. Most G-men or hard-boiled detectives or what have you, you don't need an explanation for why they are their vocation or their job. You just assume that they became employed like that at some point. But with superheroes specifically, there seems to be this need for an explanation, not only to aid in the suspension of disbelief, but to elaborate on what they can do and how, which is more important than it is for a magician. Like a magician, you don't know the full range of what they can do with their magic. It's like total wish fulfillment, because that's kind of what magic was envisioned to be. And superheroes work under a different set of rules. And we'll talk more about that. Superman's home planet of Krypton is seen in this one panel, but is not named here and won't get its name until next year, 1939. Various retcons of Superman's origin will later give different reasons for Krypton's demise, but here the planet is just old. Some retcons will have Superman's rocket crashing, but here it's just laying on its side in the middle of the road, which matches some other retcons later that suggest Superman's parents meant for their son to land in just this one spot, perhaps to be found by this specific couple. On the surface, this is all science fiction, like how Federal men used to be, but now there is something else underlying this. The rocket being discovered is similar to how Moses was discovered in a basket. This example of baby Superman lifting a chair over his head is reminiscent of Hercules being able to do superhuman feats while still in the crib. The superhero genre is thus equal parts science fiction and mythology. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more in the future. This page also defines the limit of Superman's abilities up front, something we didn't normally see in any genre. He can leap 1/8 of a mile or hurdle a 20-story building. If the leap is a running long jump, the real world record for that is almost 30 feet, so Superman's leap is 22 times that. If all his abilities are 22 times normal, then his maximum sprinting speed is 22 times the real world speed record of 27 miles per hour in a 100-meter sprint, or 594 miles per hour, which is definitely faster than an express train. A weightlifter can lift, let's say, about 240 pounds with one hand, so Superman can then lift 2.5 tons one-handed, so when he's shown lifting a single girder over his head, that's a piece of cake for him. And none of these limits will last long. Power inflation will mark the superhero genre from the very beginning, and I'm talking about that again real soon. On page 2, the story begins in the middle of the action, just as Siegel and Schuster were accustomed to doing on Slam Bradley. In the context of the comic books of the time, this lends the story the gravitas, the authority of making it seem like a comic strip reprint. And remember that the comic strips are the valuable material in comic books at this time. And they would often start in medias res like this. It also builds immediate suspense. Who is this woman? Why is Superman carrying her? Why is he carrying her this way? And is he the good guy here? We don't know this yet, but later evidence will prove that Superman, like all Siegel and Schuster's other modern-day creations, is based out of their hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. But here's a fun bit of trivia. Superman is on the way to the governor's mansion in this opening of the story, so he's actually in Columbus, not Cleveland. The governor is unnamed in this story, but in real life it was Martin Davey at this time, though this looks nothing like Martin Davey did. Between pages 2 and 3, we see two examples of Superman wrecking doors in a way that perfectly encapsulates the power inflation that I talked about earlier, and one of the weaknesses, really, of the superhero genre. First, he wrecks down a locked wooden door, but then he can't follow that up with wrecking a second locked wooden door because we've already seen him do that. So now it has to be a tougher door. So the second door just happens to be a steel door, even though you wouldn't normally see a steel door on a bedroom. And this the spectacle has to escalate, right? Each challenge has to be bigger for there to be new suspense. But you don't need a lot of suspense because he broke down the first door. We have a pretty good idea that he's going to be able to break down the second door too. It becomes less important in the genre what a superhero can and cannot do as opposed to how he does it and what flair he brings to his game. His particular style. Here, despite how serious the situation is, Superman can't help but pause and smirk at the butler's jaw-drop look of astonishment. And that tells us as much about Superman as any superhuman feats that he's done up to this moment. We know now that Superman has a sense of fun about his abilities and enjoys the reaction that he gets when he uses them. I really like the countdown clock on page 4, something we don't see a lot of in comic books to come. Even the extreme use of hatching in the background here, something I normally attribute to lazy artists, is useful as speed lines for the movement of time itself through these panels. Also on this panel, we see Superman as Clark Kent for the first time, though we were told his adopted name was Clark Kent on the one-page origin story, so it shouldn't come as a surprise to us now. Kent is coming down a short flight of steps from an outside door onto a sidewalk, suggesting he leaves a tenement apartment in the mornings. Seemingly at odds with what we know about Superman enjoying seeing others' reactions to his powers, he's apparently in no hurry for public acclaim and prefers to keep a low profile so people will think he's an urban myth. And up to this point, when he confronts the governor, he has apparently been very successful at keeping this low profile. His Clark Kent's boss, yet unnamed, though he does have a name, we'll come to that. Um, George Taylor, I gave it away. George Taylor uh, suggests here that reports have been streaming into the Daily Star about this urban myth for some time. The name the Daily Star was not a real Cleveland newspaper, but the name does come from the Toronto Daily Star, a newspaper Joe Shuster's parents continued to get delivered to them because they were from Toronto. Something that you did at the time to get local news because you didn't have the internet. Superman's downtime between adventures lasts less than a day, as Kent is sent to report on a report of a wife beating in process. The two scenarios are similar, only in that a damsel is in distress in both, but the social ill this time is domestic violence instead of murder, and we are shown a different solution to the second scenario. Threatened by Superman, the wife beater faints, revealing him to be a weak bully and a telling indictment of domestic abusers and what they really are. Note this panel, where Superman's clothes are not called a costume by the narrator, but a uniform. This is an important distinction, and yet one that the genre has wrestled with ever since. Is it a costume or a uniform? Sometimes it will be one or the other, and sometimes it will be both. A costume implies the concealing of identity, while Superman's maskless costume clearly does not do that. In a clever inversion of the heroic alter ego, Superman is the true identity, and Clark Kent is the disguise that conceals his identity. A uniform implies vocation, as if Superman's job was to fight crime. This isn't literally his job since he's a vigilante working outside the law, and vigilantism is a crime, but it's the job that he's given himself, and he sees this as his uniform that he's chosen to wear while doing so. Much mockery has been made over the years of his long underwear and what appears to be more underwear on the outside of it. But he's actually dressed as a circus strongman, as they were in those times, wearing a tight body stocking and another looser layer over his crotch for modesty. The cape also embodies the theatricality of the circus. So why is a vigilante, who is obviously doing serious work like stopping murderers and wife beaters, wanting to look clownish and circusy? And I think we're going to see more evidence of that shortly. But while Superman is okay with terrifying wife beaters and the like with his powers, he doesn't seem to want to frighten everyone. He doesn't want to frighten everyone. Let me emphasize that. So he doesn't want to dress in a frightening manner. It's on the same page that we are introduced to Lois Lane. At this time, she is not yet a reporter or Clark Kent's equal. She writes what she calls sob stories for the Daily Star instead of hard-hitting reporting. And this is an interesting choice that they made because Siegel and Schuster were certainly not squeamish about showing men and women as equals. Over in their feature Spy, Bart Regan and Sally Norris are equal partners as spies. Lois can't be Superman's equal without making her superhuman too, but she can certainly be equal to Clark Kent, and that's a change that happens soon in the stories. Now, why couldn't she also be a superhero? Because at this time in the superhero genre, there is only one superhero. There is no shared universe of superheroes. There is just the one, and everyone else is normal. That is obviously going to change later on, too. I also want to point out here that although it appears Lois and Clark are at a swanky nightclub, they are actually just at a roadhouse, though admittedly still swankier than Patrick Swayze's Roadhouse. And this reminds us of two things. One is that in the 1930s, people wore their best clothes when they wanted to be seen on town. And two is that while they both worked for a newspaper, neither was a star reporter yet and couldn't afford to go all out on a date. This might have seemed like a throwaway reference, But I believe it was well planned, as was Clark Kent's debut on the steps of a tenement house. Because one of the most shocking things about Superman is, if you really think about it, not so much his powers, but the fact that he never uses his powers to enrich himself. You know, Mandrake the magician has a tuxedo and he has a manservant and he's got a fancy house. Clark Savage, Doc Savage, has a high rise headquarters, all these workers and all these scientific devices. And this is a superhero who is quite content to live the life of the working class in America in the throes of the Great Depression. And later on, this will change. Superman will also get a super fantastical fortress of solitude like Doc Savage. Um, and he'll have robots and all kinds of things, access to these things. But at this time, right now, he's just got a cheap flat and money for a modest date. Except for his powers, right? He's just like you and me. The iconic green car from the cover gets almost 2 whole pages of comic book action before its destruction. The website Bleeding Cool has an interesting article from all the way back in 2013 about what kind of car this is, and the best guesses seem to be that it's either a 1937 DeSoto, a 1937 Plymouth Deluxe, or a 1937 Hudson, without being a perfect match for any one of them. It's interesting that it's such a modern car, given something else that's about to happen. I'll come back to that. Now, we have already seen a knife break against Superman's skin, and we know a bullet fired at point blank range still ricochets off his skin, but we don't know yet, with these fresh eyes that we're pretending we still have when we look at this story, what will happen if a car with all of its greater mass strikes him at high speed. And we still don't know because Superman simply leaps over it, delaying the decision about what will happen. Note how much leaping Superman does. He can't fly yet and won't have that power for a year or two longer. Very much so, Superman's powers are about getting from point A to point B. And we're going to brush on that topic again soon, too. There's a curious panel here where it's hard to tell what Superman is doing. I think we're supposed to assume that he's in mid-swing, lowering himself down from the telephone pole, though this could be a lot less static, and it kind of looks like he's laying like a human hammock with his feet propped up on something off-panel. The following panel, though, is much better and nearly as iconic as the car crashing scene. This scene tells us so much about Superman's presence, how face-to-face Lois feels overwhelmed by him. There's also so much implied sexual tension here, with Superman leaning in towards her and her dress strap off her shoulder. But that's still not the end of our rapid-fire Superman adventures, as soon, possibly the very next day, Clark Kent is assigned to travel to the South American Republic of San Monte. San Monte is fictional, but the war it is in seems to be modeled after the Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay from 1932 to 1935, which is why I think it's odd that the car is from 1937 when we could just say that this story is taking place in 1935 and this is the same conflict. And then strangely, Clark doesn't go to San Monte. Connecting dots we aren't informed about, Clark goes to Washington, D.C. to investigate Senator Barrows. This diversion will tie into the trip to San Monte, but not until next issue. It doesn't make a lot of sense, as if two storylines were poorly combined here. These last 3 pages introduce us to Alex Greer, the slick lobbyist corrupting Senator Barrows. It's also interesting that we're told that he's corrupting Senator Barrows, not that politicians are inherently corrupt. Interesting distinction. Political corruption, though, is the fourth focus of Superman after the murders, domestic violence, and organized crime being the first 3. So far, we've talked about what Superman did in this story. Now let's talk about what he didn't do. Of the 4 criminals he dealt with in this issue, he only got physical with the wife beater. He used his powers to intimidate, terrorize, and sometimes immobilize his foes, but he never once resorts to strength to cause injury. Being nigh invulnerable gives Superman a luxury other heroes never got before him, and that is the luxury of restraint. The superhero genre will quickly move away from this to embracing violence from its heroes, but at least in the beginning, the genre is refreshingly peaceful, considering that heroes in the Western genre or the action adventure genre are usually just shooting people with guns. And the final panel is a blurb for Superman's adventures that refer to him as a strip character, even though Siegel and Schuster have sold the rights to Superman to Detective Comics, perhaps secretly hoping that one day they would get ownership of their creation back to shop him around, as a comic strip character again. And why wouldn't they think that they could? They had already seen firsthand strips passing back and forth between National and Comics Magazine. They might have also been aware that George Brenner retained the rights to the clock and took that from Comics Magazine after that folded to Comic Favorites. What they hadn't reckoned on was that none of these characters developed for comic books were yet considered valuable intellectual property, and all of that is about to change. But more on that another time. I have really talked enough. I've got plenty to do today, possibly in this room. So if I don't see you again before Christmas, have a wonderful Christmas and enjoy this gift. And I hope to see you again soon. Also, be aware that if you want to leave me a gift, I've got the Patreon that I'll link to in the bottom that you could maybe leave me a little gift in. And you could also like and subscribe to this channel if you've never done so before.